thanks for the invite today. I was happy to get on a plane and come out and join you. So my name is Tanya Doran. I lead the Western Canada carbon team for Stantec Consulting within our building sector. And you're probably thinking, what does that mean? So we just heard some talks about, that 37,000 foot level. I believe that was referred to. I'm going to talk a little bit lower down to the ground. We're probably going to hit the 10,000 foot level. And what we're going to talk about in terms of policy, emissions reductions, and what perhaps you all need to be thinking about in your own organizations and your own investment opportunities as we look to drive to a low carbon economy. So I'm going to start with a little bit about me. So I will confess the $2 trillion opportunity is not my title. That came from an RBC report that talked about the opportunity that we have here in Canada and what we have to do to invest. So $2 trillion is something most of us cannot fathom when we're doing that. It's something most of my building owners, my portfolio owners, the clients that I work with, frankly, can't even fathom, nor do they have the ability to budget for that kind of investment that's necessary to get their portfolio to a zero carbon requirement by 2050. So that's 26 short years away. But before we get on to 2050, does anybody in the room, can anybody tell me what happened in 1973? Anybody? All right. Can you, Richard, tell me what happened in 1973? All right, so.
You're referring to the oil shock when the
Perfect.
OPEC, what became OPEC, sharply reduced the shipments of crude oil to the West in the wake of the Israeli, the Yom Kippur War in the fall.
Excellent. Nobody can ever answer this question just for, they're afraid to perhaps. So this is good. So yeah, we did have a reduction in oil. We did have to start to curtail oil. We certainly started to see some of those embargoes come into place. We did not have appropriate fuel in our country. So certainly some pieces there. Just for the record, for those of you that are also want to do some quick math, it was also the year I was born. So it makes it a really easy conversation for me to start this discussion at. But we're going to jump forward a few more years. So I'm going to jump forward to 1990, a bit about me and my career. So I started my career launching it with energy efficiency programs. Some of you might remember this logo here in BC. It still exists, Power Smart. So I started my career talking about things like fridge roundup programs, light bulb replacement programs, high efficiency motor rebate programs. So all of those pieces that are there. I'm going to admit, I'm from Alberta, so I'm an Alberta girl. Every now and again, I like to remind people that we had a 2002 climate leadership plan in Alberta. So it morphed itself into a 2006 plan, later into a 2015 plan. I sat on a panel for 2016 about getting it right, the panel that set up Alberta's first energy efficiency agency, so that we were no longer the laggards in this market, because at this point in time, we were the only jurisdiction in North America not to have an energy efficiency agency that was incenting GHG reductions and greenhouse gas reductions. So we moved on a little bit from there. Then we jumped forward a couple more years. 2019, Alberta came out with yet another climate plan. So the one thing I want to remember, and there's 4 things here that I want you to remember at the end of this 20 minutes, is this is not new. So this is something I have been doing now for 30 years in my career. It started 50 years ago, probably even before then. Most of you probably started this year. Used to call sustainability, was probably something your grandmother did. It was something I see. We have lots of folks out there in the trade show area that are likely doing some of what they've learned as they were growing up as well. So this is not new. It's the first thing I need you to remember this morning. There's a few other things on the building side of this world that I'd like to just resurrect. So the business case for net zero energy and carbon exists today. We've had that business case. We've been able to do the financial investment, understand the ROI, and do that for probably a couple of decades and seeing an adequate return on investment. We've seen that come from REITs, property owners, large portfolio owners. The other thing I know to be true is codes are for laggards, not leaders. I'm going to trademark that at some point so that every time it gets said, I'm going to get a royalty. Codes are for laggards, not leaders. Codes and building codes are designed to keep our buildings from falling down. They are the least we can do to avoid going to jail. Period, when it comes to buildings. That's what codes are for. In fact, in the city of Edmonton, as they adopt the National Energy Code for Buildings 2020, they are finding that 70% or 75% of the building permits that are coming in today already exceed step 1 of the building code that we are adopting in 2024. They are only going to pull up the laggards. Some things that I want you to also remember here, occupant health and well-being matters. So while we can drive GHG reductions, we can do all kinds of things. We can design you as a team of building experts, a building that's gonna look a lot like a prison, no windows, super efficient envelope, all of those good things. But you're not gonna be happy in that building. You're not gonna have access to adequate daylight. You're not maybe gonna have proper indoor air quality. Occupant health and well-being matters. So we can't lose sight of this as we drive to a low carbon economy, that the people in the buildings and the outcomes of what happens in those buildings is less important than the efficiency themselves. And the last one, and this is my bias here at Stantec, I work with an integrated team, but a strong integrated team can achieve impressive results. That often includes your process team, your manufacturing teams, your client, your building operators, not just your design team, for either new or existing buildings. So I'm gonna quickly go, and I feel, again, a little like I'm preaching to the converted, but why does all of this matter? Well, for me, this is why. Most of you have probably seen this. This is the warming stripes. So this is the last 50 years in terms of climate warming and why this matters, but it's really starting to hit home here, close to home. So climate change, in BC here, in Kelowna in particular, or in these areas, it's a serious threat to Canada. We certainly see this in the news. British Columbia's had some extreme climate disasters. So in the last few years, a couple of years ago, I was presenting to the Burnaby Board of Trade virtually, thank you, COVID. And while we were doing that, my colleague was presenting with me out of our Victoria office where they were having extreme rainstorms that resulted in extreme flooding down in that area, and he was losing, surprisingly, internet connection. It was a great example of why we need to focus on solutions in real time for the Burnaby Board of Trade, as my colleague kept dropping in and out of having electricity during a major flooding event in the island. But on top of some of those, we're also gonna see some of this. We're gonna see some extreme heat. So 46 degrees in Canada. We're seeing more of this. This was in Lytton during the fires just recently, just down the road here, starting to see some of those unimaginable heat waves that we see coming on top of major events like the fires in Fort McMurray. In terms of that, those other heat domes that are coming and driving that, and you heard our guest this morning talk about the fact that it gets a little crunchy here in about 6 weeks here in the Okanagan. But we also continue to see some of these extreme heats. And there's an interesting stat that kind of got glossed over during 2021's heat dome in Vancouver, in that more people actually died of the heat dome than died of COVID that summer in Vancouver. So something to think about. I can speak to my own team in Vancouver where they had their apartments that they were living in while everything was still shut down. Some of them were living in apartments that were 42 degrees C inside during the day working. My answer was go to the office. That is not safe. This is now a safety moment. We're gonna talk about your health and well-being. Go to the office. You cannot live in an apartment and work in an apartment that is 42 degrees C in perpetuity for 2 weeks in a row. But then we talk about BC floods and that impact that really we have. So these are some greenhouses. What happens when we can't access our food population? What happens when we can't get it out? What happens when we can't get transport fuel through that road that got washed out back into the lower mainland? How does that impact our economy? What does that look like? And we're really starting to see that individual result of climate change impact, not just us as a society, which is hard for us to imagine, at that big scale that was even just talked about, but really how it impacts us as individuals. We no longer can get the food from our food basket here down in the Abbotsford area with extreme flooding. And then we see things like extreme heat warnings. But on the side of that, we also see things like, finally, extreme cold warnings. So in Vancouver, just this last winter, at -12, we saw things like pipe freeze in high-rise buildings because they weren't designed to withhold those kind of temperatures for as many days as Vancouver did, really putting an impact on our economy, on the investments, on the portfolio, and how we can continue to see those buildings operate. So you can't operate in a building if you're looking to invest in it, if you can't have people in the building for 6 weeks at a time due to ongoing flooding due to freezing. So anyway, we're doing this dance, first floods, now fires. How are we gonna continue to dance between these climate extremes? This is really focused on BC, but this is true in every market, in almost every region, globally for the most part. And why is it important? Why is it important to you? There's one piece that I want to pull out that I want to talk about because it continually comes up for my team as we're looking at the existing building infrastructure. It's that climate change is really transforming our insurance industry. So we are no longer going to be able to insure for these climate-related disasters, particularly in the building sector. So, we already know that they won't insure for buildings that are built in a floodplain if there's been known use to build in a floodplain or known to build in a floodplain before. But more importantly, that we're really starting to see this impact again, not only us as individuals, but really starting to impact us as investors, as building owners, as portfolio owners, as manufacturers, and how we can invest and try to mitigate some of that risk so that the insurance industry can really start to quell some of these fears as well. And we can start to adapt and really prove to that industry that we've mitigated some of these impacts of climate change as well. So all of this gives me a lot of this, frankly. Climate anxiety. Does anybody else in the room have a little climate anxiety? See lots of sustainability out there. We're all doing things. We're all trying to save the world, I think. That's why I think some of us probably put our feet on the ground every day, is to make it just a little better. It does give me a lot of climate anxiety. Second thing I want you to remember today, there's hope. So we certainly have hope in terms of where we're going on this. In the buildings world, I like to focus on not just the problems, but the solutions. So we have lots of solutions, and I'm fortunate to work with a team at Stantec that can solve these solutions. We certainly know, it's been clear for years, it's time to cut carbon. It's time to really focus on our emissions and our reductions. We have opportunities here in Canada. This started in 2016 with the launch of the Pan-Canadian Framework. There's about 8 initiatives within this framework that address buildings in particular. They're really pushing towards both new and existing buildings, pushing code adoption, but also pushing with additional investments that we've seen come forward from our federal government and that reinvestment of carbon tax. So we're really pushing towards net zero. So by 2030, we have to be net zero energy ready for all new buildings. By 2050, net zero energy across our entire buildings portfolio. That's where this comes into play. It is a $2 trillion opportunity. So I'm going to do just some math for you. I have some clients that have about 2,500 projects, so a large municipal client buildings in their portfolio. They do a deep energy retrofit on approximately 10 of those buildings every year, to the tune of about $10 to $12 million is their budget on occasion. So 10 buildings a year, 2,500 in their portfolio. Who's going to do the math with me? So that means in 26 years, they're going to be about 2,200 buildings short of hitting a net zero goal if they keep following their business as usual plan. One municipality, 2,200 buildings short. This talks a little bit about the opportunity. So when we look at some of those emissions reductions and what we can do, we know that buildings account for almost carte blanche in every area, urban environments, about 40% of all of the emissions that are generated out there. So buildings are about a third of the problem, transportation is the other third, and then that balances everything else. When we look at those buildings, almost entirely or a third of those emissions come directly from space heating. This can be higher in more efficient building or less efficient buildings. Water heating is the second. So I know that there's some products out in the trade show that are really looking at water heating, water reuse, and what that looks like as well. So go chat with them. Then our appliances and equipment. But we're really focused on that space heating as a prime area. This is the hope part. So this is an application for the Green and Inclusive Building Fund. It's a grant application from the federal government that certainly my team has just looked to design. It is for First Nations University of Canada in Saskatoon. It's designed to meet the Canada Green Building Council's zero carbon building standard. It has got a passive design. It's got a low TEDI score. So TEDI is a thermal energy demand intensity. It really tells us how much we are going to use with our efficient envelope. Sorry, it's in Prince Albert, not Saskatoon. But I want you to pay close attention to that little orange pie. That's the space heating. So that pie traditionally is about 40%, sometimes higher in buildings like this. We have that down to just around 12%. So there's hope. This is where we are. But the thing that I want you to learn out of this one is that we have reduced our load first. So we've really focused on efficiency first. So we know that generation is 6 times more cost effective to conserve that energy than to create new industry. And that's almost carte blanche. That's regardless of whether we're talking about putting back on a coal-fired plant, small nuclear plants, wind, solar, whatever the case may be. Efficiency first is the easiest payback to reduce our carbon emissions. 6 times over. Almost in general, every time we see a study, regardless of jurisdictions, that's about the number. So keeping that in mind is a really important piece. In fact, we are starting to see more and more of this. This happens to be out in Nova Scotia. More and more of this, again, out in Nova Scotia. So coast to coast, we're starting to see more of this. There is, this is from CanWIA, the Canadian Renewable Energy Association, around the currently installed wind and solar energy capacity right across the country. So even in BC here, where there has been misnomers, and for years I've heard solar isn't going to work, we're starting to see that coming. We're starting to see the likes of BC Hydro and others start to invest in other renewable alternatives as well. So we're starting to really see some of this come. And the other piece of that is we're seeing that decentralized generation happen that starts to talk a little bit, and there's many converts around grid reliability and other issues. Perhaps our panel later will talk about some of that on that side. So really focused on that investment first. So I'm going to just jump back to codes for a minute. So we do have something in Canada called the National Energy Code for Buildings. It came into adoption here in 2015, and it started with, well, early, the Model National Energy Code for Buildings way back in 1997 there, but National Energy Code for Buildings 2011 came into play in 2015. We've had a couple of different versions now of the NECB. 2017 is there. And we're really looking towards that existing building energy code. So you'll see that I have that somewhere around 2023. Here we are in 2023. I have heard now, just recently, that we may see an existing building energy code in 2030. So a little disappointing. 90% of those buildings that are going to be here in 2050 are already here. It's been pushed back a little bit in terms of that code adoption. Certainly there was a market signal for those of you that are looking to invest in buildings, portfolios, manufacturing, and all of those in existing facilities. That existing building, that market signal's there in the National Energy Code for Buildings 2020, that if your building was originally designed to meet an energy code requirement and you are retrofitting that building, you will have to increase it to the latest version of the code. So there's a market signal there that it's coming at the rest of our existing buildings. What they're doing is they're going to take their sweet time getting there till 2030 now. So keep in mind, all new buildings have to be net zero energy ready by 2030. And that is exactly when we're going to start to address our existing building portfolio. We've now reduced the time frame to 20 years to address the 90% of buildings that are already here and will be here in 2050. So we're a little past our time right now in terms of when we need to have a sense of urgency. Some of the other problems that we might have with code is not everybody's adopted code. So as a matter of fact, Whitehorse in its entirety adopted NECB 2020 the day it was released as a municipality, not even as a province. So we really have codes all over the place, and harmonized codes would be my ultimate dream. In British Columbia, you have step code as well, which means that we really have 83 different versions of the code here, because every municipality gets to choose their own adventure a little bit, which is fantastic, but that means that a building that is purpose-built in Surrey is different than a building that is purpose-built in Whistler. So very different as well. The good news here is we also have some Canadian carbon policy. So every one of those pins that you see in Canada, and we put it through there in the States, every single one of those jurisdictions has a green building policy, a sustainability policy, goals to achieve. They're focused largely right now at a municipal level or a provincial level on their Scope 1 emissions, so those emissions that they are generating themselves. They're looking at their Scope 2 emissions for the most part, but hold on to your hats, they're coming for your Scope 3 emissions. They're coming for those community emissions. They're starting to look for those, and they're starting to find ways on how they're going to do that. We're seeing that written in their policy. We're seeing that written in terms of their organizational behavior, and we're seeing that as an understanding on what they're going to look like. So the third thing I want you to remember is this is our future. So we've heard a little bit about this, that needs early this morning, that needs of the society, starting to meet those larger needs as well of the finance world. But this is what I know to be true after 3 decades, is the green building economy will create jobs. This is ultimately clear. It came out of the CAGBC as well. They've done a report that also the RBC $2 trillion opportunity started to talk about, where that we have some direct investment, so 1.5 million jobs that are available as this market starts to grow. Certainly those jobs are apparent out there in the trade show. Every job right now is a green job in lots of ways. If you're a plumber and you're installing a water efficient furnace, you have a green job. If you're a tin basher and you're installing a heat pump, you have a green job. So everybody has those green jobs, and it's just acknowledging it. So I started a not-for-profit by accident 6 years ago. And it's this, you can ask me later, it's the Smart Sustainable Resilient Infrastructure Association. It's based in Alberta. And our first survey of our members, where we talked to them around green building and products that they were driving, had in the market to drive innovative solutions for GHG reductions in the built environment, we asked them what sector they belonged to. 60% of them didn't see themselves as belonging to the green building sector. They saw themselves as belonging to the tech sector. So they were out talking to people in the tech sector when they really needed architects and engineers to spec their products in the green building sector. So really interesting, they didn't think that they had green jobs in a building sector in the construction and the design and construction industry. So we still have a bit of a disconnect, and we still have some place to play and some gaps to fill in terms of what that investment looks like so that we can create these jobs. A couple other places. So the last fourth thing I want you to just remember outside of the jobs and the economic development side is we already do this. So I am very fortunate that I get to work with a team that looks a little like this. There's about 30 of us just here in Western Canada that spend our days every day focused on these solutions, both new and existing buildings, process loads, manufacturing loads, buildings, utility services. I work in an organization that's been ranked the most sustainable corporation amongst its industry peers by Corporate Knights for the last few years, and we're always in the top 1% of the world on performance. So not only are we doing it, we're walking the talk. We already do this. I'm very fortunate. We can get to zero. So this is a project out of our California office. It's net zero energy. It is a LEED gold project. We're targeting that LEED gold certification as well. This is Lee Valley Elementary in Plano, Texas. It's one of my favorite. I've taken people to this school a few times. I'm not going to show this image, but there's a lovely image of grade 2 students adding up their kilowatt hours from the renewable energy system. That warms my heart as they learn some math. It's kind of beautiful. Varnes Net Zero Library, a LEED Gold certified project, also net zero. I believe it's out of Colorado. The Denver Water Administration Building, so net zero energy as well as LEED Platinum certified. This building is also looking to certify under the WELL certification. So again, occupant health and well-being matters. So really beautiful space inside. This is a passive house project targeting passive house certification, the Fort White Alive project. It is in just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba. So, if anybody's been to Winnipeg, cold climates as well. Yeah, really a beautiful building that will stand the test of time there. And then lastly, if anybody's ever been to Edmonton, this is Stantec Tower. It is the tallest tower west of Toronto. It is LEED Gold Core and Shell certified. And then there are a number of other offices. I think there's 7 other certifications, including our friends at Denton's in this office on LEED Gold as well. So 69 stories, 29 stories of those are offices, 483 residential units, quite large. We're really proud of it and proud of the sustainability ratings in that, including that health and well-being rating system with Fitwel certification. And last but not least, Evolve One. This is a project out of Waterloo where we're talking about really envisioning that zero carbon requirements, looking at the requirements of the tenants, aligning to the ESG goals of the tenants that they were attracting into this particular development, and really starting to see some of that space when they're looking for office space that they're walking the talk as well. So we know that there's some good stats out of LEED certified buildings that talk around those projects listing for 20% more and leasing out 20% faster. That's again, almost a carte blanche stat across every market since that stat first started being delivered in Seattle really early on, about 2010. So we're starting to see some of those. So again, this Evolve One is zero carbon certified. It's a LEED Platinum certified project. They have done some on-site generation with solar, not only on the building, but also in the car park to offset some of that. So that is the end of it, but there's 4 things today I want you to remember. First one is this is not new. We've been doing this for decades. We know the solutions. It's about asking the right questions. We have hope. So there's lots of hope. We have policies, we have procedures, there's goals. You saw every one of those municipalities and those pins on the map already starting to deliver those policies, looking after their full scope of their emissions. It's our future. This creates jobs. It adds into that thing that, or to the piece that we heard just in our first keynote around that societal need and balancing out some of those. It's our future. And I think the key thing that I want you to remember is we already do this in a lot of places. We already started to address those 40% emissions, and we're well on a path to achieve that success by 2050 if we can continue and we can find that gap that's between how we finance it and what that larger society need is. So my last challenge to you is just be the change, ask the questions, be the disruptor in the room, and continue to focus on what we need to do as a society so that we can achieve those really impressive results. Thank you.